Welcome, everyone. It is wonderful to see such boisterousness and enthusiasm for the beginning of our Spring Symposium. I would like to welcome... Are you able to hear me over there? Is the microphone on? Okay, great. So, good afternoon. Thank you for being here. My name is Jonathan Laurence. I'm director of the Clough Center for the Study of Constitutional Democracy, and I'm also a professor of political science here at Boston College. I'm delighted to welcome you to our 2025 Spring Symposium on Envisioning Democratic Futures. This symposium is the culmination of our engagement with this theme all academic year, with the participation of student fellows, faculty affiliates, guest speakers in seminars, and with many hundreds of attendees at public events on campus. Many of our fellows and faculty contributed to the newest edition of the Clough Center Journal, with essays addressing how their own research in a range of disciplines, including English, psychology, sociology, journalism, economics, and philosophy, helps us consider the ideas and practices of democracy. And they illustrate the many dimensions and necessary conditions of democratic life that deserve a place in our discussions of politics and law. Now, when choosing this year's theme more than a year ago, we were entering the largest election year on record. More than 2 billion voters were called to the polls across the world's vastly different democracies in a variety of circumstances and under varying degrees of freedom. And it has continued into 2025 with recent national elections in Germany and not far off in Poland and in Iraq. And as we are now aware, the elections have resulted in a lower share for incumbents across the board almost uniformly. Now, on the one hand, you might say this is simply political alternation at work, and political alternation fosters a dynamic democratic environment. And moreover, abstention levels are generally low. So why then choose this annual theme? Why are alternative futures in need of envisioning? Well, this is in recognition that democracies set for themselves ambitious goals of self-improvement with an emphasis on process rather than on outcome. They are in a constant state of becoming, of envisioning a more perfect or more democratic union. For over 2 centuries, modern democracies have been works in progress, defined by the evolving struggle to earn rights and gain access to participation, to debate vigorously the role of the state and the reach of public policy. But to envision democratic futures is also to acknowledge some ominous reversals. Until recently, democracy was a regime type with long-term growth prospects. The third wave of democratization confirmed this trajectory, seen here on a map comparing 1977 and 2017. Now, the optimism that this trajectory created, this sense of democratic destiny, was reinforced by the end of the Cold War, from the so-called unipolar moment, which left the US as the lone superpower, through the spread of democracy to Iraq and Afghanistan, up to the Arab Spring in North Africa and the Middle East. But despite occasional successes, any notion of democratic inevitability, or indeed even for enthusiasm to promote democracy, has been tempered by recent developments. The number of countries classified as democracies by the Economist Intelligence Unit's index fell from 79 in 2006 to 71 today. The number of authoritarian regimes and democratic autocratic hybrids rose from 88 to 96. And the share of the world's population living in a democracy is also shrinking, and this is only partly a function of demographic trends, because there has also been a downward trajectory in the quality of democracy. Now, this began in some of the newly democratized nation states in the latest wave, but it spread to the more established democracies. Now, democratic backsliding ultimately can lead to the fundamental violation of the separation of powers, or the failure of checks and balances in our constitutional order. Half of all countries in this index, 167, registered a meaningful decline in their Democratic Index score last year, which is far more than the small number that showed improvement. And recent elections have revealed a familiar clash of philosophies, of ideologies, but they've also illustrated the contest of raw power, of economic resources and communication strategies that can reinforce or undermine democratic institutions. But the inherent volatility and vitality of our institutional arrangement does not detract from the sense that we are living through a critical juncture. Some observers see evidence of widespread crisis. Institutions are not delivering results and needed services. And rampant polarization can be understood, as Craig Calhoun put it, as an index of the political establishment's failures. Our contemporary woes do seem to confirm a distinct pattern. After 2 steps forward of democratization and the spread of voting rights and of other civil rights and freedoms in 1776, in 1848, after World War I, after World War II, after 2011, the world's democracies have frequently experienced 1 step back. However, we should not overstate for just how long our democracies have been firing on all cylinders. Women have been voting for only 2 to 3 generations or less in democracies around the world. In the US, although the 15th Amendment prohibited racial discrimination in voting rights in the 1860s, the Voting Rights Act dates only to the 1960s. Across Europe, many religious minorities have had a relatively brief experience of religious freedom, dating only from the 1970s. So this has multiple implications for how we evaluate the democratic crises of today and how we reflect on our own imperfect pasts. Nostalgia for earlier eras has ominous implications for anyone who was not considered a full citizen with inalienable rights at the time. Just 80 years ago, today's most robust democracies still excluded huge swaths of the voting age population. Now, while electoral processes may run imperfectly, today there is a much higher baseline from which our contemporary systems are backsliding. Global surveys since the pandemic have tended to conclude that although most people prefer democracy as a system of government, they're increasingly frustrated with how it functions. The reasons they cite are the economy, immigration, education, healthcare, infrastructure. And all of the grand coalitions, democratic fronts, and cordon sanitaire cannot hide the cost of this disconnect between electoral outcomes and policy outcomes. So the recent success of populist parties is the expression of this declining trust and the failures of representation, and above all, of the thirst for political alternatives. So political alternation, again, as such, is healthy, especially when governing parties are unpopular, but there's a danger, as one recent study put it, that democracy has become the incumbent in an age of anti-incumbency. One is reminded of Churchill's adage that democracy is the preferred regime type, only insofar as it is better than all those other forms of government that have been tried from time to time. Well, we have growing evidence that voters are in one of those exploratory moods. Of course, democratic constitutions were written and amended in response to tyranny and unaccountable government against British, French, and other European monarchies, and then in the aftermath of Nazi and fascist and later Soviet authoritarianism, whose techniques were influential across hemispheres. On the other hand, there is a powerful effort now underway to question that consensus and to reinterpret the lessons learned under illiberal regimes, and to suggest instead that it is the errant liberal foundations of our constitutional orders which are in need of correction. So how do we know when the safeguards are gone, when constitutional democracy is under threat? Is it always, by definition, too late? When does customary political confrontation, the deployment of rhetoric and persuasion, and the push and pull of democratic jockeying for power become a crisis? How do we know when we're out of the partisan forest and into a new and different thicket? And alternatively, how will we know when we're on smoother terrain, when we're out of the woods? This is what we're here to consider at this Spring Symposium. And I would like to acknowledge the work of the Center's many student and faculty fellows in bringing this event together, as well as the support of Gloria and Chuck Clough, who are the benefactors of this center, and who demonstrated real prescience by calling attention to the importance of studying how democracies work more than 15 years ago. I'd also like to welcome our provost, David Quigley, whose academic support has encouraged the center to thrive. We are graced with an impressive lineup of scholars and practitioners to consider how the world's democracies are evolving. Speakers include international experts, esteemed scholars who have collectively written a room full of books and articles, and many of whom traveled far to be here, and we're very grateful for that. Our speakers will also include key officials who have been active in promoting democracy over decades, including today's keynote speaker, Mr. Brett McGurk. But first, we will tour the state of democracies around the globe, from Europe and the United States to the Middle East, followed by the first keynote address. And tomorrow, as you see, we will approach the issues thematically, engaging with the role of artificial intelligence in shaping tomorrow's democracies, and a discussion of the cultural and economic foundations of democracy, concluding with another final keynote by another senior official who has served in multiple administrations. Our first session today, which asks how democratic will Europe be tomorrow, will merge directly into our second session on the United States, followed by a coffee break. So that concludes my introduction. Thank you again for being here. I'd like to now invite Professor Mary C. Murphy and our first panel of speakers to the front. Professor Murphy is director of the Irish Institute at Boston College and a professor of political science. Please join me in welcoming our speakers.